When the Steam Deck came out originally a few years ago, it was the undisputed champion when it comes to emulation. But I feel like that's changed quite a bit since the release of a bunch of these other emulation handhelds. But that doesn't necessarily change the fact that the Steam Deck is a powerhouse of emulation, being able to emulate all the way up to PS3 and Xbox 360 generation titles. It is very impressive, and the ease of use has gone up dramatically thanks to things like EmuDeck and Emulation Station coming to the Steam Deck platform. It allows for such an ease of use and level of accessibility to emulation on the Steam Deck that, frankly, is very impressive. And to have that on a device like this, with the level of support from the community, it means the Steam Deck has quite a long life ahead of itself of just being a dedicated emulation device, even well after the successor comes out. So, regardless of what the end or the sentiment of this video eventually becomes, keep in mind the Steam Deck is still a powerhouse for when it comes to emulation. But here's where my opinion starts to change. The Steam Deck can be had for as cheap as $300, and that puts it in competition with some other, Android-based devices, namely the Odin 2 and other similar devices that, frankly, to me, make a lot more sense if you're buying a dedicated emulation handheld. Not even necessarily for the fact that you can find other devices for cheaper that would probably do the same things but better, but overall, the Steam Deck just feels a little overqualified for that. The Steam Deck is designed for PC gaming, but using it for emulation is something that is most certainly something you can do, but to me, sort of defeats the whole purpose of what the Steam Deck truly is. And the Steam Deck doesn't have the best battery life in the most charitable circumstances. So even when emulating games, unless it's like 8 and 16-bit titles, you are going to start noticing you're chewing through a bit of that battery life. While you can emulate the same exact games on the Odin 2, for example, and be able to play for like 6 hours. Because the way I see it, the Steam Deck is the best gaming device out there right now. While it's not going to be the best for every category of gaming, it can do every single category of gaming in my opinion. That being the case, just because it can do emulation, and emulation quite well in fact, that doesn't mean it's the best way to emulate some of these games. And for some of them, it is the only way you can emulate them, because I don't think there's any way outside of these PC handhelds to emulate PS3 titles. I don't believe there is a PS3 emulator on Android, but I could be wrong. I haven't really looked into that because emulating PS3 just feels like that legal gray area. You can still buy the vast majority of those titles on other platforms, or they have been remastered in other platforms. So it just makes it kind of weird for me to emulate those, just because, that was like directly most of my childhood playing that generation of games. So it just feels weird to do that for me. It's the same reasoning behind, emulating Nintendo Switch games. It is possible, and it's way better than this actual Nintendo Switch in most cases, but it feels weird emulating a current generation console. That's where you start entering the legal gray area of what emulation truly is. So bear that in mind if you're considering buying this device for that reason. Tangent aside, the Steam Deck offers sort of like your, all-in-one solution. If what you're looking for is something that can do everything, the Steam Deck is the best choice. But if you're looking for specifically just an emulation handheld, you could be better served by the myriad of other emulation device choices. If all you really want is to emulate 8 and 16-bit titles, you'll be better served by one of the many cheaper handhelds out there from Anbernic, and even Powkitty has a very interesting device for $40 right now. So there are just better options for the more specific kind of emulation you want to do. And if you just want the best all-round emulation experience, I would pick up the Odin 2. The Odin 2 Mini is probably the one I would recommend the most, just because I love the design. It'll sacrifice a little bit of battery life for its smaller size and higher quality screen, but I feel like that's a worthy trade-off for its, increase in portability, being able to also have the same exact power that the Odin 2 Normal offers. So for that, I think I would probably recommend the Odin 2 Mini above everything else. But there's also other devices out there. You could try like the Neo Pocket S, which is a device I've talked about before that is good and it has the potential out there to be the best and most powerful, but in combination with its price and less than stellar driver support and optimization from these emulators, it ends up performing the same or a little bit worse in some cases as the Odin 2. So in most cases, I probably don't recommend that one unless you really like its design, but for $400, it's kind of a hard pill to swallow. Some tremendously good values out there. Like the Retroid Pocket 2S is probably one of my favorite budget options to recommend at $99. You can emulate quite a bit of systems all the way up into the PS2 and GameCube era. And granted, it's not the entirety of each of those libraries, but you get a good like 65-70% of their libraries, be able to play pretty much the most popular titles. So it's kind of hard to argue with that level of value. I love the Steam Deck, but it just doesn't make the most sense as a dedicated emulation handheld. Because you can load stuff like Batocera on it, to my understanding, and that could be a good way to turn it into a dedicated emulation handheld, but it just seems like a bit much. There's really no use for all the extra power the Steam Deck has outside of brute forcing your way through something like PS3 emulation, which is notoriously difficult to do. So outside of that, it just doesn't make a lot of sense, and there's a lot of work already into a bunch of these emulators on Android, so they end up sometimes performing a little bit better in my opinion. And that's not to say that you can't get, the Steam Deck to perform as well as the Android devices. It's just that it takes less effort to do so to get the most out of the Android devices. While on the Steam Deck, it will take a little bit more effort and a little bit more conjiggering to get the emulators to run at the most efficient and most powerful they can. And that could be different now. I haven't used my Steam Deck as a dedicated emulation station in quite some time, but it just never made the most sense. As I've said before, it just seems like a huge waste of what the Steam Deck's power is capable of. And quite frankly, is a little bit overkill for what you're trying to do. You would be better served by the more emulation optimized handhelds out there. It doesn't even necessarily have to be Android based. It could also be one of the many Linux based distributions that you might find that Amberdeck uses and Powkitty uses. And there's also a bunch of community made resources for those kinds of devices to run and operate better. Things like Garlic OS, MIUI, all those other operating systems you can flash onto these devices to make them better. The same level of community support that you find on the Steam Deck is available on other platforms. So to answer the question posited by the title of my video, is the Steam Deck still the king of emulation? And I would say on paper, yes, the Steam Deck is probably one of the most powerful emulation handhelds you could buy, but it just doesn't make practical sense if you're looking for a dedicated emulation handheld. So while yes, the Steam Deck is one of the best options out there, it could be done better elsewhere. So what do you guys think? Are you interested in buying the Steam Deck for just an emulation handheld, or do you think it'd be better served by one of the other handhelds I've talked about in this video? I would love to hear what you guys think about this down below. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. All the other social media coverage down below. And last but not least, have a wonderful day.